solitary occupations retired in 2016 to devote himself full-time to running the household. Carlo Pizzati is the author of 2 novels, 3 non-fiction books, and a collection of short stories. Pizzati's latest book, Mappillai, an Italian son-in-law in India. Anita Nair is author of several best-selling and critically acclaimed works, which include The Better Man, Ladies Coupe, Alphabet Soup for Lovers, and her latest offering, Eating Wasps. Chandrahans Chaudhary is the author of the critically acclaimed novel, Arzi the Dwarf, and Cloud. Arzi the Dwarf was shortlisted for the Commonwealth First Book Prize. Kiran Manral is an author, TEDx speaker, columnist, mentor, and feminist. She has written books like The Reluctant Detective, Once Upon a Crush, All Aboard, Missing, Presumed Dead, amongst others. Ms. Manral, on to you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a very interesting discussion that we have up ahead because the novel, as we all know, is something that we've grown up on and something that they keep telling us is dying. And that worries me a fair bit because I definitely don't want the novel to die. I'm sure none of us do out here. Just to go back to how the novel began, we come from a culture with an oral tradition. We had the epics. I believe Wikipedia, the first novel was A Tale of the Genji, which was written by a Chinese lady in the 11th century. And she just kept writing it until, I think, for many, many years. And it was a lady writing a novel, then the growth of the printing technology that came in made the novel possible. Gutenberg, all these developments have contributed so much to how the novel has developed and changed over these years. What I would like my speakers to tell me is, Upamanyu, let me start with you. You wrote English August at a time when it was completely radical for that kind of a novel to come out from India. Have you seen a change in the kind of novels that are coming out from the country over the many years since you wrote that?
Hello. I'm not sure I mean, Once Upon a... What's the title? Once... what? But, you know, people are still sort of writing books and reading books, so I'm not even sure I know what the title means. It's, I mean, times change, societies change, so if the form of the novel changes, it's no big deal. I mean, it's, maybe I should just pass.
Anita, when you wrote Eating Wasps, which is your most recent book, it is like the way Chaucer did his Canterbury Tales. It was a selection of short stories woven together by a common theme. And I think that was among the earliest novels that we really had, the Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the Decameron, and all of those. Was there any reason you chose this style of narrative for your book?
I think one of the reasons is that more than the Canterbury Tales, I was looking at actually the Indian oral tradition where a story leads to another story. Especially in the case of Eating Wasps, I was thinking of the Vikram and Vetal stories, so where there is a query and then there is an answer that has to be found, except that there is no answer provided here, which is with the reader. The reader has to provide the answer. So, and I've always been drawn to trying to create a narrative where there are multiple stories inside that. So for me, the Canterbury Tales, yes, of course, was one of those books that did influence me right from the beginning. But I would think just about as much would be all the various Indian stories that we've had, typically those ones that were passed down through storytellers.
Talking about the storytelling and the oral tradition, now from the oral tradition we've gone on to the digital medium. And Carlo, I'd like to come to you with this. You chose the short stories as your medium for your first book. It's a compilation of essays and first-person account of you being...
Can you hear me? Hello? Does this work? Can you hear me down there?
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for being here. No, actually, I have published 2 novels in Italian. My first book was a memoir, and my latest book is a memoir. It's called Mappile. But I have something to say about the dialogue that novels have with memoirs. And I also have something to say about maybe a bit of a crisis that the novel is going through nowadays, which is connected with the digitalization of information somehow. So for me, I started writing a novel because I discovered that the small city of 30,000 people in northern Italy where I live was called, instead of being called Valdagno, was called Criminal in a fresco in the galleries that go towards the Sistine Chapel in Rome. So obviously I became very curious in doing an historical investigation, but I had also a personal story I needed to tell about a neo-fascist violent father. So I wanted to write about patricide. So I was able to intertwine a very autobiographical story with a historical search. Right? So the second novel was instead about a picaresque adventure that took place in Latin America where I lived for 3 years. But again, I mixed a lot of the biographical with the fictional. And this is what led me to writing the kind of memoirs which I call memovels, because to me they're more like memoirs and novels in the same book, which is something that is happening right now widely in literature. It's called autofiction, perhaps. It led me eventually to write Mappile, which is the memoir of my 10 years in India, but it's very fictionalized in the sense that as my novels were always very based on documents, discovering the mystery of why my town was called Criminal in 1580, or discovering what happened to the skeleton of Che Guevara while investigating Nimodo, Mappile also is based on the 10 years of experience, but it's fictionalized because I enter into characters' mind and I tell what I think they're thinking, and so I use fictional tools. And this happened because a book editor rejecting my third novel basically told me, you know, you live in the coast of Tamil Nadu, you live in a beautiful place, you're leading an extraordinary life, so why don't you just tell us directly about this extraordinary life? And I will come to the point, because this is what's happening a lot in literature today, I think. I didn't think I was living an extraordinary life, but Antonio, this editor, kept telling me, you know, I want to know what you think about when you're looking into the dark of the Bay of Bengal at night, and I want to know what's going on in your mind, as in a novel. And so I told him, Antonio, you know what's going on in my mind is, why the heck did you reject my third novel? So I used this anecdote to begin the memoir, which is, I guess, in a meta-literature sort of technique. But this is happening a lot, so I think that maybe what we can talk about is also about the crisis of the novel, and why a lot of readers today are asking more for authenticity to come from a memoir type of narrative, like in Karl Ove Knausgaard's The Struggle, a 6-volume series of his own life in Norway. Elena Ferrante, the Italian writer who has written a tetralogy, 4 chapters, which are fiction, but obviously based on her life, even though she's an anonymous character. So what's interesting to me in the journey of the novel now is this relationship between fiction and non-fiction.
That's a very interesting point, actually, Carlo, because I think Upamanyu, your first English August, I think could be termed in some way as autofiction. It was based on your experiences as part of being in the services. And now, as you see this becoming a very popular medium, how do you feel the novel per se has evolved, this autofiction as a medium?
Well, I think, you know, I mean, most fiction writers rely very heavily on their personal experiences. I think it was Henry James who said, I think it was Henry James who said that people who write fiction do not need to write autobiography, because all of it sort of, you know, all of it draws heavily on personal experience, and personal experience in the widest sense which includes not only what you've seen and felt, but what you've read and what you've heard about, all of it. But what to me seems obvious is that the fiction form is, is mercurial. It can, because of the size of a book that can vary from 20,000 words to 500,000, because of the size and the elbow room it gives you to do what you want. You can put in what you want, you can take out what you want. In fact, I don't know if you read Joyce's Ulysses, which is I think 500,000 words plus, and if you say remove 100,000 words from it, you wouldn't notice. I mean, no one would know because it's so plotless. And to me that seems actually quite remarkable, because it actually just shows what you can do. I don't think you can do that with any other form. So I don't think people have stopped reading. It's just that maybe they want, all books to be written in the form of SMSs or something. But I don't think, people have stopped reading. I mean, if they don't read now, it's because they've never read. It's just, yeah, I mean, it's not, thank God my children read. I mean, if you...
The culture of reading, we were just discussing that on the previous panel about how children are really not reading these days because there's so much to take away attention. There's digital, there's Netflix, there's games and everything. But as writers in a digital age, are we still thinking, I'll throw this open to all of you, are we still thinking with a Gutenberg mind in a broadband world? Anyone who wants to take it?
Anita, do you want to say? I have an opinion about that also, in the sense that I agree with what you're saying, and I think there are some narratives that remain. I mean, there is a universality to the quality of great masterpieces, and yet readers change, and we have changed radically with the digitalization of information. So, in Victorian England, Dickens needed to hide his affair for his young mistress in the cloak of a story, because the society at the time was not accepting such things. Homosexuality needed to be very hidden. Today, in most Western countries, and today in India as well, thanks to the abolition of 377, that is not a taboo any longer. And so, more and more taboos are falling away. At the time that Joyce was writing Ulysses, there was a specific moment in history happening. It was particularly important. Then the novel died in the 60s, according to the French writers, right? The death of the novel, and then it resuscitated again. But there is a relationship with our sense of intimacy, and that we transfigure in a novel by hiding it in what could be called a selfhood, right? A fictional selfhood. And nowadays, with social media, Facebook has got more users in India than anywhere else in the world. We are used in the millions here in this country to expose publicly our intimate life. So this must have an impact in the narrative and how we write. This is, I think, more of a reason why actually readers demand the authenticity of the story, and why they are interested in knowing that the story is true. And that's why magic realism has gone through a crisis, which I don't think it deserves to have gone through. Murakami's latest novel, luckily, is the latest example that magic realism is still alive. And yet, I think that unfortunately, for those who believe only in the purely fictional novel, the readers do have a need to know that the story is true more and more. But they also need to escape in a world of imagination.
I think it's rather difficult for me to kind of imagine another way of writing, because I've always written in a particular way. And in some ways, the reader is of no consequence to me when I'm writing the book. It's pretty much a story that I'm telling myself. So if I am able to keep myself interested, and then I think that eventually when it reaches another person, they're probably going to find it just as interesting or probably more interesting than I did. So for me, everything else doesn't kind of come into the equation at all. I mean, typically when I write, I do have a very definite idea on what I'm going to be working on. It's not like, I'm kind of like shuffling around, trying to find something. I know that there is a particular abstract that I'm trying to explore, and the telling of the story or the novel or the narrative is pretty much an understanding of that abstract. So it could be anything. It could be about the consequence of desire. It could be about artistic integrity. It could be any of these themes for which there are multiple points of view, and this is my point of view. So the rest of the world, the way technology has changed, probably the telling, all of that completely doesn't matter to me when I'm working on it.
I find that very interesting. When you write for yourself. It's not the reader. I do know a lot of novelists, when they're writing, they're thinking about the reader and how the book will be read or received. And the process that you spoke about, Upmanyu, basically, when you mentioned Ulysses and the fact that it was stream of consciousness in such a huge tome, do you feel that all the experimentation that could have been done with the form of the novel has been done, now there is hardly anything left to do with it anymore?
Frankly, I don't care. I mean, most of the time, novels, you write yourself, so you don't, it just doesn't come out of the top of your head. It's constructed very painfully. All of us do that all the time. The plot changes, characters change, the very idea of the storyline changes. So I'm really quite confident of the future, as long as people sort of, in fact, if they stop watching TV, I think that would be one of the nicest things that could happen to world culture. If they just start reading more, you just find think the world would be a better place. So it's not as though the form is dying. It has a life of its own. Why don't you tell us what you think?
According to me, it's like stairs and escalators. They both coexist, so the digital world will coexist with the printed world. And that's something I've been meaning to ask everyone too. Carlo, I think you would have a good take on it because you've been writing it online as well. Do you think the online medium has shortened attention spans in a certain way for readers, and readers are demanding easier to read content, which is then impacting what novels are really getting attention and readership?
Yes, I do think so, unfortunately. I mean, there's a shorter attention span. There are techniques against that. I teach that at the Asian College of Journalism. I teach communication theory. I teach my students how to download the material, turn off the Wi-Fi. My son has a smart box he uses to study from 3 to 6 in the afternoon. He puts all his devices in the smart box, so instead of having a smartphone, he gets smart and the phone gets dumb, because that's the thing with smartphones, I think, that they are smart and you get dumber. So it's fine. I think it's about, there are techniques you can learn how to use digital. It doesn't have to be the end of literature at all, I think, actually. So e-books, the availability in a remote little house on the beach, like where I live in the middle of Tamil Nadu, you can't find a bookstore nearby, so we do download if we need to find books without books. We read the digital as well, my wife and I there. So I think there are a lot of advantages. What I was saying is, this difficulty to concentrate also, according to some literary critics, and I kind of tend to agree, makes it a bit more difficult more and more often to concentrate on imaginary fictional characters in novels, and there is this demand for you to be the player. This is why in my memoir I decided to try to be the character, the narrating voice, and tell the truth and be extremely honest like my character was in the novel. So it takes a little more courage, because that means you expose yourself in the embarrassing parts about you know, well, you have to read it, I guess, to find out the embarrassing parts. There are of all kinds. So I think that's the way in which it has impacted the novel, because I think there is a demand for that. The attention span can be cured, because the way children learn to read in elementary school, they can be taught how to e-read. So actually, the Ministry of Education should start a program in which children are taught how to use the iPad as a reading device. That's a very useful thing to do, I think.
It's sort of obvious, isn't it, that the speed and the attention with which you read would depend on what you're reading. An SMS or the newspaper or something on the net, or or Shakespeare. I mean, it's completely natural, and you would yourself pay far more attention to a sort of a great text than to an obscene joke.
So, like Upamanyu said, I really do think that ultimately what decides is the quality of the writing. You know, what is it? What is it that you're going to be reading? If you're going to be reading a blog on a holiday spent somewhere, obviously you're going to kind of skim through it. But if you're going to be reading something else that kind of addresses certain concerns or probably certain ideas that are kind of lurking in your head, but you don't have a definite idea about it, then you're definitely going to spend a little more time reading it. And I mean, while everybody keeps having these doomsday predictions about people reading lesser and lesser, I really don't think so, because every second day then you read that, and then the next day you read this article or a report or a study saying that people are reading more. They're going back to hard copy reading rather than reading their Kindle and so on. So it's pretty much like the health watch that we have. There's a kind of contradicting report all the time, but since we do see that publishers are still in existence and they haven't died out, obviously there are books being published and more books are being published and people are reading. And yes, we might watch things on OTT platforms and so on, but it probably at some point you get tired of it and then you just want to just lie back with a book and read it rather than, be told what you have to see. So.
That's interesting, going to books as a refuge from the OTT platforms. As creators, I'm very curious, because when you're writing, there is imagination, which is so important. But there is also Google, which is omniscient. And if you have something in your head, earlier you had to think what it might look like and what color, texture, shape. Now you have Google to give all the facts. So as a writer, as a creator, do you feel technology has aided you, hindered you? How do you see it affecting the writing process?
Well, it depends. I mean, in the sense, one only trusts, at least I only trust Google up to a point. If it's just the date of Jahangir's death or something, But if it's something a little more deep, I go to a book. I go to there's something far more solid in a library book than Wikipedia. So it depends. To answer your question, it depends really on what you're looking for and how important it is to what you're writing. So.
Yeah, so what I do is try and mix the world of Google, which is like a labyrinth. You get into it and you get lost and you get sucked into reading about things that are absolutely of no consequence to what you're working on. But one of the more interesting things that I discovered quite recently is that I was reading a book on the ISIS caliphate, and there were all these names that was coming up, and the book didn't have too much details about them. So then I would go and Google them and find out more about them and so on. So it made the reading experience, because I was reading nonfiction, it made the reading experience that much more complete in that sense. But as a writer, I do know that I have found lots of things, learning to kind of navigate the search engine and learning how to use it so that I know exactly what I need and what I should stay away from.
You know, when the Greek alphabet was invented, Socrates wrote that humanity was going to be doomed because we were going to lose our capacity to think. Because now we were going to be able to put our thoughts into those little tablets. And so we would lose, and he was right actually, because it is true that at the time the capacity to memorize long text was much higher than the capacity we have now. The capacity of my father to memorize entire chapters of the Divine Comedy is reduced to my capacity to remember some poems I learned in elementary school, but he could recite the Divine Comedy by heart. So now that we have Google, there is a serious danger, of course, to induce a heightened amnesia, because we know we can reach out into it. So definitely there is danger there. That is why we have to teach how to use it, and we have to keep exercising our memory. But then again, we have an incredible research tool. I mean, for me, I was able to do so much research for my novels and for the memoirs, thanks to Google, discovering. So when you get lost in that search, for me, if you have some sort of a direction, it's as fascinating as being lost in the labyrinth library of Jorge Luis Borges. You know, it's the same thing. Only that instead of having to travel, like I had to travel to the Vatican Museum Secret Archives, to the Secret Archives in St. Mark, to discover about Criminal. But I also did a lot of research online instead. So I think that two things can go together. We have an amazing, powerful tool which can work against us if we're not aware of it.
Which can work against us. And as somebody who's been watching the publishing scene evolve, and of course we have, as Anita said, people writing and people reading, and there seem to be more people writing these days than people reading. I would love to hear, Upmanyu, this entire self-publishing trend that's come up, where people publish their own books. Do you feel it has democratized the writing process in a certain way, or has it has done away with the gatekeepers, so to say, of literature? Is it a good thing, you feel, a bad thing? How do you see this panning out in the long run, self-publishing?
I don't know what the figures are, how many sort of books are, self-published. But it's a damn good thing. I mean, you go to a publisher, he turns out to be a moron, he's not interested, even though it's a good book. And you publish it yourself, it's a damn good thing. I mean, I'm not sure what the market is and how but nowadays, what with the net, it should be quite easy to actually flog it. A damn good thing.
Lovely. So I'm glad to hear that you think so. What about you, Anita? Carlo?
Self-publishing, I think the only danger in that is that there is absolutely no filtration process. It's not as if there is someone helping you kind of tease out all the horrible parts and enhance the greater parts. So if there was some form of editorial inputs coming in, then I guess it works, because ultimately, a publisher chooses a book for several reasons, some of which might not have anything to do with literary merit. So in that sense, yes, it allows a person who's passionate about the art that they're working in to find some form of expression and, to put it out into the world. But unfortunately, what you see is a lot of rubbish being published as well. So, I mean, as self-published. I'm not saying that publishers don't publish rubbish. They do as well. But, at least you can blame them for it. But here you have to bear the onus of it.
Well, I agree entirely with what you're saying, meaning both positive and negative. It's also true that the world of publishing is not so efficient. Sometimes it bypasses great works of art, and we have seen it throughout history, of course, the infinite rejections, the posthumous celebrity that never was able to find a public in his life, of course. So self-publishing is great in that respect. The only thing I can add differently from what you both have said, which I agree with, is a thought that I had about a French thinker called Pierre Bourdieu, who was criticizing the effect of television on meritocracy. He was saying, now you will see that in talk shows, the people who are better at communicating in talk shows will improve their career. So even scientists will improve their career within their very serious realm of science because they're very good talk show hosts. And so you will have people who don't deserve to be on top of certain universities, research centers. They are there because they're visible. By the same token, self-publishing brings out also more easily writers who are better at marketing themselves. So again, you might have a fantastic writer who tries to self-publish himself, but if he doesn't have the marketing tool, so you might have some great marketing self-publishing sensation who doesn't deserve to be read, and you read it because you're convinced by the great marketing he's done. So I think that's the only limit of self-publishing.
That's a very valid point about marketing being so important these days in the world of publishing. Also, self-publishing brings me to something else to do with digital. We've had novels. The form of the novel basically came about with the serialized stories which started in the newspapers back in the post-industrial age after the presses became popular and printing became cheaper. Now what we're seeing in the online space is a series of short stories on mobile apps. Do you see the form changing again? Are we going back to the shorter version which then accumulates into a longer novel? Have you ever come across the short stories which then become a huge novel in a mobile app? Do you see this entire process?
I'm not going to ever, I think, read anything in the form of a mobile app. So that's out. But, you know, anyone who writes will know, or should know, I think, that, you know, the plot sort of selects its own length. You know, you write, you know, you have a big idea, then suddenly you find you can finish it off in 5,000 words, and something else you want to do just demands a full length 100,000 words. So the length of the novel is not a matter of concern. Actually, as I said earlier, neither is the form. That too actually selects itself. You toy with something that intrigues you. You fool around with it. Then you see that, well, this is not working out. You put it aside. Maybe you come back to it 10 years later and do something else with it. So it's all fluid, which is a good thing.
What do you think, Anita? Have you come across these serialized short episodes that then go into a full-fledged novel?
Yeah, so the thing that, you know, there's this, I forget his name, but he used to be the host of a radio show, and it used to be called, I think, the Prairie Hour. It used to come in Midwestern America. And so he went on to write these stories, and it always begins with, "It was a calm day in Lake Wobegon," and then it goes on thereafter. And what I discovered was that he was like pretty much like, it was like a serial. You know, it would come, I mean, these were the same characters, they would appear in multiple stories and so on. But this is again in the 1960s. This was not the here and now. So I do think that yes, the short story is going to survive. The novel is definitely going to survive, and mobile apps will come and go, but writers will continue to write no matter what, and the reader will probably experiment with different forms of reading, but will eventually look for a story. And I'm not too convinced that mobile apps are going to kind of eat books, you know, so that's not going to happen. Yes, there might be people who might want to you know, read on the mobile app probably while they're in the metro or, you know, wherever they are. But personally, I couldn't do it myself.
I was in Korea just now, and a lot of people are reading books on their mobile phones, on their entire books or chapter books. In certain societies, it has penetrated more, like Japan and Korea. I've read War and Peace on my iPad, my wife at the same time. We decided to read War and Peace together so we'd know where we were, you know, because it can be synced. So I am not against that at all, the usage of a mobile phone when you're in a long line and you happen to have that novel and you can continue it there. It's perfectly okay, but I think that it's a mistake if literature or publishing goes to chase after the short attention span and starts producing short stories to cater to that. We should do exactly the opposite, because we should remember that wonderful place of silence, of that smart box I told you about, and you should give yourself the quality of time of turning off that thing and getting on the novel or the memoir or the memovel, and allowing yourself to have 2 hours, 3 hours of silence without interruption of beeps or notification or anything. So I think that it's a mistake if the industry chases after the shortest attention span. It should like be warriors in favor of deep thought, because we are losing that if we are constantly going only to the weapons of mass distractions that are the digital tools. So I think that it's important to not follow, to just find a public or a market. There is also a duty in keeping deep thought in humanity, right? And the novel brings you that.
I agree completely. There is beauty in deep thought, and we all need to pursue that, definitely. And shorter attention spans, of course, a product of our age, but we need to live with it and go beyond it. I was reading a very interesting experiment about how readers can influence the end of the novels in certain interactive mediums. You have options where you can decide how the novel goes. So as a creator, Upmanyu, I'd like you to know, is that something that would interest you to see, to have multiple routes your novel would take, which your reader could then select and choose? This is obviously on a digital format.
No, it's a crazy idea. I mean, at least for me, the last thing you want is your reader to tell you how your novel should look. This is not what you've asked me, but the crux of it is, there are some books that will sell 20 million copies. I don't think I'll ever write a book like that. But there are some books you write, 15 years later, you're bored to death waiting for a plane that's 5 hours late in some damn transit lounge, and someone comes up and says, I loved that book you wrote. That's enough. I mean, that's more than enough. And you say, okay, that's it. That's why you write. And it's not this, well, this is just to keep the discussion going, but this is not what we are in the business for.
I can see 15 minutes more, 10 minutes more. I think we'll open it up to questions. Do we have questions? Can hands go up, please? We have a question right there.
Okay, yes. I needed more of advice than a question as such. I'm speaking to 4 novelists. Being a teacher, I have engaged classrooms of students for the last 18, 19 years, and even dry subjects like law. I have been able to sort of tease through stories, and that's a challenge. Now, that's an achievement. The question is how to put it down into a novel. I've been told many times to write. So one question I had to ask the Mr. Clark is how to convert biographical to fiction. So that is one. And you said biographical to fiction, the conversion from the novel being a biographical expression to fiction, how to do that, number one. In a classroom, when one is talking orally, one can change the narrative by watching the reaction of the audience. You can't do that in a novel, so how to introduce that dynamic, and then how to remain authentic and fictional at the same time.
This would take the time of a workshop, and I hate to do this to you, but Anita is a much more accomplished novelist than I am, and much better at giving technical advice on how to write a novel. So I would pass on the question to her due to the respect I have for all the books that she's written. So if you don't mind, I mean, really, not as a trap, because I would like to hear your answer too.
So I think one of the first things that you have to remember is that you cannot be self-conscious when you're writing. The moment you're self-conscious, about, oh, I have to make sure that this is the kind of desired response I'm going to get, that's going to fall flat. So the thing is to park who you are to the side and get into the skin of the character and write. And when you do that, then you're thinking like the character, you're speaking like the character, in the way that you're writing. And then that is going to be authentic and it's going to be honest. So I would think the first thing to remember is to tell yourself that, what Oscar Wilde has said, there is no first person in art, so that's the thing. You can't be there in your art except as a kind of sutradhar, kind of pulling strings from a distance. But the moment you are, unless of course you're writing a memoir, which is different. But if you're writing fiction, then definitely you need to kind of make sure that the character that you're creating is the one who rules the narrative and not you.
So what I have to add to that as the author of the memoir, the memoir novel, is you can do both actually. So if you are ready to lose everything, you have to have no embarrassment. You have to be quite mature at the fact that you might be exposing yourself. So if you want to become that narrating voice, that character in a memoir, which is very similar to a novel, you have to, because you need the novel to cloak the things that are embarrassing. The people that know you will say, oh my God, you actually think that, like your wife or your husband or your children, the uncomfortable truth. If you're willing to say that, you don't need to invent a name. And a lot of writers in the history of literature have had that courage. So it depends how much you're willing to really be honest about who you are and lose a lot of friendships, possibly, but possibly not. And family. But when I wrote that patricide novel, my first novel, my mother, before I published that novel, which was about a lot of personal history, violence in the family, she said, let's go visit the valley for the one last time because we'll never be able to go back after you publish it. Never happened. They sold out copies in the whole valley with the novel. So sometimes you're surprised. Honesty is a very demanded capital, and people are very happy to hear it.
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
All right. I couldn't help noticing that all four of you were very optimistic about the future of the written word in novel format. And I was just wondering, since the four of you are authors, and I'm one too, so I'm speaking for myself also. I'm asking, is this something you need to believe? Is that something you need to believe? Because you need to wake up in the morning and find the discipline and energy to write your book, right? And you also, Upamanyu mentioned that, and Anita also, you all mentioned that you all aren't fans of the new digital format, reading on your smartphone or maybe Kindle. But if you talk about the younger kids today, they'll say, why would I carry a big fat book and wander around? If it's not on the internet, I'm not interested. And besides, see, earlier we had J.K. Rowling and her Harry Potter series, George Martin and his Game of Thrones, which had mass appeal, across the world. And yet, you will find people who know anything at all about Harry Potter and the series only from the television shows or the movies, right? So do you really think that the written word has the power to pull in a mass audience without television and Hollywood to push it through?
What is sure is that television, TV series, and PlayStation, video games also, cannot be as good without great writers. And so it's actually, we're interconnected. You don't have great movies without great writers. Not that all great movies are based on great books, but they have great screenplay writers. So writing, yes, it's not going to go away because it's at the basis architecture of thought and of storytelling. So you can't have a narrative based only on images. You can, but it doesn't sustain throughout the centuries. Writing does.
Yeah, because you were saying, is it something that we need to believe in? I'm not sure about the others on the dais, but I definitely don't need to believe in that, because this is something that is part of my existence. I'm not going to wake up in the morning and tell myself, do I need to breathe today? So for me, it's part of my life. So I will continue, even if nobody is reading me, I will continue to write.
I'll just add to that, Anuja. I think there is this need to constantly tell stories that doesn't go away. And until that need doesn't go away, one hopes that the novel will continue.
Hi, the question is to all of you. In the context of the discussion we had on self-publishing, So in the time, can you hear me now? Yeah. So in the time to come, do you Hello. Sorry. So in the context of the discussion on self-publishing, in the time to come in India, do you see self-published authors getting a lot of visibility at, literary events like literature festivals, even though they may not be having good backing, of any publishers or, in that context? How do you see self-published authors, doing for themselves in the times to come in terms of visibility or, being able to get platforms to, talk about their books?
You could organize your own festival. I mean, what the hell? No, just, jokes apart, just be independent. Or if you know the right people in Times of India, that's the other way to do it. But actually, the sky's the limit. You've written your own book. As I said, some moronic publisher turned it down. You publish it yourself. And then you form an informal club and you bounce ideas off one another and say, okay, let's just do our own festival. Why not? No, I'm not kidding. It's one way to get going. I mean, don't lose hope.
I'd just like to add to that. Today we have Amish Tripathi, Ashwin Sanghi, Savi Sharma, who are the highest selling authors in the country. And they all began with self-publishing. So at the end of the day, it is, I think, how the story gets received and they're at all the literary events right now.
Okay.
This question is your latest book. I'd like to thank you for writing such a wonderful book, Eating Wasps. I just wanted to know that, I mean, he's talking about, a lot of reality and a lot of autobiographical space in it. I mean, all these stories that you enacted, I mean, many layered women. I would just like to know how much of it was fiction, how much of it was true story, especially the main protagonist. That book was amazing.
Thank you. And, well, the main protagonist as in Sri Lakshmi you're talking about. So it's very, very kind of loosely based on an actual writer in Kerala who killed herself in 1965, and nobody knew why she did it because she didn't leave a suicide note behind. So that was all I had. So the rest of it was pretty much drawn from imagination. And several of the stories in the book are again stories that I have created out of nothing. Probably I might have read a newspaper report about something, about maybe a young girl molested or a young woman who's had acid flung on her face or something like that. And that's all I have. But then the rest of it is built from the imagination more than anything else. And then, of course, one of the biggest tools any writer must have is observation. So when you look around, ultimately when you can marry observation with imagination, then you have really three-dimensional characters who pop out of the pages. So that makes you think that perhaps this is real.
Hello? Yeah. Yeah. Suppose if you are writing a novel based on some true events, probably some 20 or 30 years back, how do you do the trade-off? At which character, at which event you will go with the real story or you will just modify for your novel? How do you do the trade-off?
Okay. Well, I guess one, of course, you need to be careful you don't get sued. because if you're going to be writing somebody else's story, and if you're not going to be narrating it the way it's the way it happened, then there are chances that, you know, people could take offense and so on. But very often when you see that it's a recreation of a true incident, there is something called the artistic license to explore it, you know, and to take it to a point where you know that you are questioning what happened rather than actually just narrating what actually happened. And I think one of the other key things is to make sure that you get the setting and everything right, because you can't set a story which happened 30 years ago in this age and time, and, you know, have references to like a smartphone if you're talking about 30 years ago. You know, so those kind of details need to be worked in very carefully, thought through very carefully.
Thank you so much, everyone. I think they're telling us to wind up. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Manu. Thank you, Anita. Thank you, Carlo. That was a wonderful discussion. Please do read more books. That's all I keep saying all the time.